Policy Committee meeting. I would like to call the meeting to order. Mrs. King, may I have a roll call, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova.
Here.
Peggy Mueller-Aragon.
Here.
Barbara Peterson.
Here.
Crystal Tapia Romero.
Here.
Josefina Dominguez.
Here.
Courtney Jackson.
Here.
Danielle Gonzalez.
Here. Community members may attend APS Board of Education meetings in person at the Allison Bruce King Educational Complex at 6400 Uptown Boulevard Northeast, or watch the live stream on the Board of Education YouTube channel. Our first item for consideration and action is adoption of the June 5th, 2023 Policy Committee meeting agenda and approval of the August 1st, 2022 and May 1st, 2023 Policy Committee meeting minutes. Is there any discussion or do I have a motion?
This is Crystal. I will move to adopt the June 5th Policy Committee meeting agenda and approval of the August 1st and May 1st Policy Committee meeting minutes.
I'll second.
Oh, go ahead.
Great, thank you. We have a motion and a second from the motion was from member Tapia Romero, the second from member Jackson. May we have a roll call, please?
Yolanda Montoya Cordova.
Yes.
Peggy Mueller-Aragon.
Yes.
Barbara Peterson.
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero.
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez.
Yes.
Courtney Jackson.
Yes.
Gonzalez.
Yes. Our next item is special issues 4. Our next item for discussion is presentation of revisions to administrative procedural directive for student suspension, long-term suspension, expulsion, and due process procedures. For this item, we have T.C. Reiser, Executive Director of Student, Parent, and Employee Service Center, and Dr. Chanel Segura, our Chief of Schools. You have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Gonzalez, members of the board, and Superintendent Elder. This first procedural directive is on page 15 of your electronic documents. Changes to this procedural directive include alignment of language, clarifying language regarding the hearing process, and alignment with legal references. This procedural directive is duplicated in the handbook. This is a discussion item that will be finalized by the cabinet. Dr. Chanel Segura and Mia Lardy, legal counsel from Module Sperling, are here to assist with comments and questions.
Great, thank you. As Ms. Reiser noted, many of these are procedural directives and thus for discussion only, so there won't be a vote. But with that, I'd like to open it to discussion to see if anyone has any questions or comments.
I just had something, Madam Chair. So under the remove, and I did get this like answered, but still under removal of extracurricular privileges, and it says that students may be removed at the discretion of the principal from any part or all extracurricular privileges for the time period equal to suspension. So my question was discretion, and what one principal will do is going to be different than another one, having worked for different principals, something that a principal would just go, no big deal. Another principal would think it was a big deal. And so I mean, they say they may be removed, and there is under these 5 bullets, there's not a lot there to tell a principal what they have to do. So that's just my concern, that it's at the discretion, and then that they may be removed, not that they shall be removed.
And Madam Chair, members of the board, absolutely. I also feel that if a student's, suspended from school, their academics, then extracurriculars also applies. And so I believe that should be students shall be.
And it's just that if they aren't in school, and so I don't know if that's like, statute anywhere in there. So whatever it is that needs to be done is.
So then I guess we would also need to strike at the discretion of the principal.
It's up to you all.
So students shall be removed from any part or all extracurricular privileges.
And that you'll take back for everybody to look at that anyhow, right? So, because it's not up to us. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Members, any more discussion on this item or questions? Member Dominguez?
So I have an overarching question, and it doesn't have to be answered now, but I'm curious about how administration is moving toward addressing our board adopted goals and guardrails as you look at these revisions. And it doesn't mean that, yeah, I'm just curious about what the impact is on the thinking and discussions.
So Madam Chair and Board Member Dominguez, we have absolutely been using our goals and guardrails as a lens. So when we look at things such as, as equity, we want to make sure that our policies and our procedural directives are applicable to all students across our district, regardless of where they are in the district. And so when we're looking at specific suspension, any type of removal from academics or extracurriculars, we need to make sure, which is why I appreciate Board Member Mueller-Aragon's request or suggestion regarding may be removed at the principal's discretion, because that does create some inequity if principals feel one way at one school versus another. So that is part of what we're doing as we look through and moving forward with our procedural directives.
But are we also looking at like data on, is there a particular kind of student? And I'm thinking of Martinez Yazzie population and Black students. I know that a few years back we had a really high rate, disproportionately high rate of expulsions among Black female students, which surprised me. And so that's what I guess that's the lens that I'm interested in. How are we collecting data on these populations, or what are the plans to do that? And how will we delve deeper into if there is a disproportionate number of kids in any given category? How do we begin to think about that? And again, it's looking to the future, right? But I think it also requires us to start collecting that kind of information now.
So Madam Chair and Board Member Dominguez, we are currently working on pulling all the data, the disciplinary data from this school year, and breaking it, disaggregating it so we can have a clearer picture on where we may have an increase with some of those subgroups that you have mentioned. We are planning on presenting this at the beginning of next school year so that we are following along with our procedural directive as well to present this information to you all. But something else I think that needs to be noted is that we have worked this year with our principals to make sure that they are entering their student discipline in Synergy, so that it's not just an issue of equity regarding the consequence, but also the documentation of it. So we had some individuals who were maybe documenting it on a Google sheet or a Google form. And so we really worked to make sure that principals were clear that all disciplinary information needs to be put into our Synergy student information system.
Board Member Dominguez, if I may, I'm going to prod Dr. Segura a little bit here. What are we doing in terms of restorative practices? We did something today, as I recall.
Yes, so we met today to discuss what next steps look like. As a committee, there has been a working committee who has worked to determine which direction we want to go, because at this point in time, or I'll take us back a few months, in my observation, what I realized is that our district has undergone multiple iterations of restorative practice training. restorative justice, conflict mediation. And so I felt like we needed a reset to start over and to get us all on the same page. And so I believe that our task force has determined, goodness, and I think I have the information here. Okay, yes. So foundational training will be conducted on July 14th by Restorative Justice Education, and they are out of Fort Collins, Colorado. This training is for all school and district administrators, and then ongoing support will be provided for schools this year in a differentiated format beginning in September. So we have identified the organization that we would like to work with. And at this point, we'll move forward. The task force will move forward with specifics after the foundational training.
Okay, and thank you for that update on restorative practices. And I had another fleeting thought, and I think it had to do with how we deal with long-term suspensions and short-term suspensions in relationship to our goals, like an uninterrupted education, while giving students consequences for for serious violations. So I think that's what's down the line. That's what concerns me, is the impact of these suspensions, consequences on our goals.
Thank you, Member Dominguez. I think just also important to remember that the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights does also require the reporting of exclusionary discipline data disaggregated by race and ethnicity as well. So hopefully we are doing our federal reporting job there, so the data should be clean and available. Any other questions on this one before we move on to the next procedural directive, which is agenda item B?
I just have one quick question. So I hope I'm on the right one still. I'm trying to, in my mind, I know long-term suspension, expulsion. They're so because hopefully expulsion is it seems very grave because there's some significant consequences there. Students not allowed to be enrolled in the district, or we're not going to even accept a student who's been expelled somewhere else. So those students, where do they go?
So long-term suspension and expulsion both have to go through the hearing process. So they go through a hearing officer that looks at all of the evidence to uphold either long-term suspension or expulsion. Expulsion for general ed students don't attend Albuquerque Public Schools. For students with an IEP, they go back to their IEP team to look at those services. When we talk about long-term suspension is for until the end of a semester. So it's that.
And an expulsion could be for an entire year.
Expulsion is for a year. Long-term suspension is through the end of the semester. When a student is long-term suspended, if they are in special education, they go back to the IEP team to look at what services are provided. For our general ed students, for middle school, we have Vision Quest available, and for our high school students, we have Continuation School available.
And I'm just trying to think in my mind in terms of the distinct, I mean, I understand the process. They go through hearing officers and so on and so forth. I'm just trying to think of what are some options for our families and our children that are in that space, right? I think a lot of them end up in our charter schools because there's no, they could matriculate through an APS charter, correct?
Yes.
I mean, they're just not in our regular or traditional schools, but there's a potential for them to be in an APS charter. I just want our kids to be somewhere. I mean, I'd rather them be somewhere than sitting home or in juvenile justice setting somewhere, or parents being in trouble because their kids are not attending school. So expulsion has a time limit as well.
Expulsion is for one calendar year.
Okay. So if it happened in the spring, they still wouldn't be able to come back until the following spring.
Could be longer as well, but
Okay.
one calendar year or longer.
Okay. And generally with those students that, expulsion, it seems, because it's got to be pretty big. I mean, a big issue that's going on there. So we're not under any kind of obligation in terms of like referring them to other things or addressing, just giving families some resources or things like this, or we just say you're out. I mean, how do we do that?
We do have resources through the hearing officer, through the city, through charter schools. Any resources that we have, depending on what the violation is, we will provide to the family. The family, a lot of times, by the time they come to a hearing, have already made a choice of what they're going to do until they can return to APS.
Okay. And I would assume it's not very, I don't know. I'm in the dark. I don't even know what our numbers are in terms of expulsion or what that looks like. So I'm looking forward to that.
I will tell you, our data has our number of hearings and number of students suspended and long-term suspended and expelled has greatly decreased over the years. And again, this year, and we'll show you that data in August.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge that member Peterson has her hand up, and I think maybe member Jackson may have some questions too, but I wanted to, before transitioning to member Peterson, follow up on one of the questions raised by President Montoya Cordova around Vision Quest, which I wasn't familiar with. So can you share a little bit more about how many students are enrolled and where is it located?
John Adams.
Goodness, it was at 2 sites, and one site was closed because we did not have enough students. So we collapsed that set, and then I'm not sure which location it's at now.
Isn't it John?
Wasn't it John Adams?
We collapsed John Adams.
John Adams is collapsed. Okay.
Yeah. Hayes.
Is Hayes the site that's open? I don't have the flyer with me.
We
I
believe-
apologize. There were
Sorry,
2 sites.
There's a big thumb behind you going like this. Yes.
I think it's Hayes.
Yeah, I think it's
It's
a day.
Hayes.
Gabrielle, say no. Yeah.
I can't, I'm sorry, we can't hear.
John Adams is open and Hayes is closed.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
The other way around. Okay.
So I want to know, first semester, there was a fairly small number of students, middle school students that went through hearing that ended up at Vision Quest, which is why one site was closed. I think second semester, every single middle school student that came through the hearing process was referred to Vision Quest. And I believe there were, I don't have my data in front of me, but around 20 that were referred. Our numbers are a lot lower. So when we show you the numbers, you'll see it wasn't a lot of students to refer, but every student that came through was referred to Vision Quest.
So when I looked it up on SAPR, the enrollment shows in 2017, 6 students, in 2018, 5 students, in 2019, 7 students, 2021, 4 students, and this year, 1 student. So I guess my question is, what's the long-term theory of change or efficiency of operating a program? What resources does it take if we're serving a population of anywhere from 1 to 6 students? And just sort of how do you think about Vision Quest as it sits in the overall strategy?
So Madam Chair, members of the board, I think that goes back to like program efficacy and is what we're doing working. So when we look at that data, and again, when we get all of this data and put it together to do that presentation for you all in the fall, that will be part of it, because we had to look at the data immediately when we realized, oh, there's only a few students here and a few students here, and we have all of these FTE for those few students. Not to say they didn't need them, they did. However, we also have schools where we have 30 students sitting in a classroom with a substitute. And so we, we put those teachers back into the classroom setting and condensed it to one site. So looking at that, I have not had the chance to look at it. But when we do, those decisions are going to have to be made. And looking at alternative programming that could be offered, that's not going to encumber such a large number of FTE, because our FTE are needed everywhere.
So can you just remind us, what's the time frame for that?
We're looking in the fall, so August, September, I believe.
Member Peterson?
Thank you. I'll sort of echo, my expectation was that I'd be off the road by now, but traffic is unpredictable. So I'm going to throw out some things that are sort of overarching for the whole discussion. I'm going to participate as much as I can. I'm pulled over on the side right now, but I need to get back on the road. So I'm not sure what my connectivity will be. I mean, I think the overarching idea of this entire conversation really is, how are we teaching kids? And whether it's the most minor kind of infraction for a kindergartner, or whether it's the most major kind of infraction for a high school student, our mission still has to be to educate them, not just academically, but how do we live in a community with each other? And so I'm happy to hear that there's motion on restorative practices. I hope that we weave through that community connections, because there's strong community partnerships. And I think part of restorative practices has to include community for understanding what the goal is and what the process is as we do restorative practices. That's the main thing. We have an obligation to be educating. So as we're looking at repurposing schools, as we're looking at choice schools and all of that, we have some really successful programs. School on Wheels, Freedom High, New Futures. When we take on providing services for a group of students that are not working in a traditional school setting, we do a good job with those students. And it seems to me that instead of doing these sort of marginal efforts to serve kids' needs, we should be really looking seriously at how could we provide services in a real education for kids that are facing expulsion, because there may be some legal things involved. There may be extreme cases where we can't do that, and there are other settings. But I think it's something that we need to take on because we can do it well when we do it. Those are my main thoughts, and it carries through with everything. I mean, the one other thing that I wanted to say is that I really agree with Board Member Mueller-Aragon about needing consistency, because otherwise, I mean, not only I think does it open us up to real charges of discrimination based on from one school to another, but it's not the framework we need. But I don't think we can impose it. I think that it needs to be developed first with staffs at the school site, and then with principals in a task force that's across schools for what should consequences be. Because we use the NMAA as an excuse sometimes for excluding children, but apparently they don't have strict guidelines. So we should be able to form them in a way that meets the educational and social emotional needs of our students.
Thank you, Member Peterson, for your comments, and I hope you drive safely and are able to get to your destination. Appreciate that. I want to open it up to our speakers to see if there's any response that you wanted to give now, or if we want to just sort of weave that into our conversation as we go.
I think we can weave it into our further conversation, but I do want to emphasize that I agree, and in many conversations have had the need for consistency throughout the district, and trying to align and get things to where they need to be so that when we're looking at equity, that we don't continue with some of the inequities we've had in how, from school to school. So that is something that we are looking at.
Great, thank you.
Could I just add one more thing? I really appreciate that. I think when we try to have one policy, it either errs on the side of being way too restrictive or way too lenient. And that's why I think it's really important that we lead with that idea of our goal is education on every level. And we've got to engage the practitioners. We've got to engage in schools to see what really is working and what's not working, and what more support they need for really implementing restorative practices in a meaningful way. But thank you. I am very happy to hear that there's a plan. There's a road forward now. And I truly appreciate that.
Great, thank you, Member Peterson. Member Jackson?
Thank you. So looking at page 20 of the digital packet. So first of all, the red, but the inserted language. First of all, I appreciate that language was inserted, probably on a personal level, but I appreciate that was in there. But I have two questions. Is it in there? Because I think I read later on that's statutory, that there was a statute. And so that language is in there because it follows statute. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And then, so then my second question, which was just brought up when we were discussing charters, I don't know if there might now be a conflict, because the answer to the question, it says the district shall deny enrollment. And then the answer to the question was, but a child who is expelled or cannot enroll in an APS traditional school can enroll in an APS charter school. So is that now in conflict? Like, I'm wondering if that language just needs to be, because the way I would read it is, if it's an APS charter or an APS traditional, no matter how it's the APS district, you cannot enroll and you'll need to go to an NMPED charter. But the answer to the question was they could enter an APS charter. So there seems to be discrepancy.
So the paragraph is actually written that, if you look at that last line, I'm sorry, member Jackson.
It's okay.
The paragraph's actually written where we would take the information to our chief of schools to have a conversation. And what we've done is we've actually added a checkbox into Synergy so that their parents have to answer the questions. Are you long-term suspended or expelled from your current school or the previous school you attended? If a school misses that and enrolls a student, then we could go back and look to, but we're trying to add some safeguards around students with serious behaviors in other districts. As for charter schools have the same guidelines. They could choose to enroll or not to enroll, just as we could.
I think
Yes, but, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Clarify.
Yeah, so to clarify, the question though is, let's say somebody comes from ABC private school in Albuquerque and they have been expelled from ABC private school, which means that they now cannot, according to this, cannot enter an APS district school. Does APS district include the traditionals and the charters?
It does not, Member Jackson, it does not include APS charter schools. So APS public school is separate and apart from an APS charter school.
Okay, that answers my question.
Great, thank you. Before I go back to Member Dominguez, I had one question that I had submitted late. And it's sort of in response to a little bit of what member Montoya Cordova was speaking to about the process. But the question is, who are the hearing officers? What are their qualifications? Do they typically have any expertise in child and adolescent development? Do they understand the impacts of childhood trauma and ACEs on student behavior and decision-making? So who are they and what are their qualifications?
So we made some, Member Gonzalez, we made some major changes to the hearing office this last school year, about mid-September. When the position opened, we changed it to a more of a contract position, and all of our hearing officers, our retired administrators who do have an educational background, an administrative background, and so they do have the knowledge of what's good for schools. We look at what interventions have been put in place. And so we've created a more comprehensive system of looking at the students when they come to the hearing. And our hearing officers do understand students, the educational process.
And so is there any specific qualification related to demonstrating understanding of child development and ACEs?
So I think that training, because it's constantly changing. And I'm not quite sure, you'd have to speak more to that, TC, that we look at the minimal qualifications of the educational background, the administrative licensure, and their knowledge of the educational setting, but I'm not quite sure what the training looks like for them. I know they do get training through legal counsel, and I'm not quite sure if ACEs and all of that is part of that. I know it as part of the hearing process, those considerations are put in place because you are learning about a student's point until they get to where they are sitting in front of you. And so those things are discussed. I'm just not quite sure what kind of training is involved. And maybe that is, if it's not, that needs to be incorporated.
So one of the things, Chairperson Gonzalez, that I can say is I have been advising student services now for over a decade. So I have seen numerous iterations of the hearing office and where it stands today in terms of the change this past year to having basically a pool of hearing officers. And all of those hearing officers are former educators, former administrators, individuals that have been in the classroom, have run a school. So they already come from that background. And then in terms of the training that really TC implemented over this past year was us really taking a look at the hearing process and the structure. The nice thing is a lot of the hearing officers have themselves sat in the administrator's position and have had to put on a hearing for a hearing officer in the past. But we went through, the handbook, the process that needs to be followed, considerations that need to be followed. I personally do not sit in every disciplinary hearing. I only become involved if the parent or the guardian brings legal counsel to a hearing. So I have seen my fair share of hearings, and this year they have run extremely smoothly and in a real good process. And then I believe there will be training again in the fall before the school year starts based on the new student handbook.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the improvements to the hearing process and the contracting of hearing officers. I do think worth exploring what additional trainings or opportunities might be made available. I think typically retired administrators are a little bit more old school on some of the disciplinary approaches and maybe less up to date on some of the new and developing research on child development, brain development, and implications for behavior and decisions. So just another suggestion. And I will turn back to Member Dominguez.
I'm going to echo that sentiment. When I look at these kids, the kids who are getting in trouble, they're dealing with trauma, and I think mental behavioral health needs, and so I worry that we aren't appropriately addressing that facet of the disciplinary process. And I'm not promoting that, the schools be left with that, with those kids. If they've done all they can, we need a different option. And I finally remembered the question. I think it was first semester of this year. I attended a brief workshop with Chris Chapman, and I just wonder if he struck me as someone who was well informed and had a program that could very well benefit our district. I wonder where his work fits in with this reset on restorative practices, if at all.
Madam Chair and Board Member Dominguez, I would have to speak with the individuals in the task force regarding what that looks like and how they came to decide upon this organization. This is the information that I have right now. I think I can bring Tanya Campos up to speak a little bit more to it. It is in her department and they've been working on it quite a bit.
So Board Member Dominguez, I believe Chris Chapman was an individual that we had been looking at. We've always are looking at multiple people. One of the things is who's out there, who can bring different perspectives and who can bring in things that maybe we're not meeting the needs right now. So that was more, I think, just kind of a conversation to meet with him. One of the people we've been working with, for probably about 5 years now, which is very similar, is Dr. Shiroki Hawley, who does the culturally linguistic teaching and training. He's out of LA. We actually connected with him initially through the New Mexico PED office. And he's actually been on contract with us for several years. He does similar work with Chris Chapman did. Another reason why we already had someone actually very similar on board. He does a lot. His work is not restorative practice per se, but it's very connected with restorative practices because what he's really focusing on is behaviors. And there's multiple different types of behaviors that he looks at. In fact, the number one behavior, he says that we're as any K through 12 district is, or culture is age culture. That is the number one outside of anything else that schools have to really understand in terms of our students coming from an age culture on there. So he does a lot of work related to that in terms of how to identify behaviors. Where are they at more appropriately? Doesn't mean that it's a per se bad behavior, but where is that coming from? And how as we as educators can kind of redirect those behaviors more appropriately in an educational setting that doesn't have to be punitive. Basically, it's an educational moment for our students as well as our staff too. It talks about how as adults and staff, we can model that as well. So he's one of the many people we already have on contract that's doing phenomenal work. As well as, again, we're looking at particular restorative practices vendors. One of the things we've noticed, and I just wanted to add in about like local, absolutely, there's some wonderful people who are doing locally restorative practices work. What we're finding though is that they don't have the capacity within themselves to be able to tackle a district this size. So what we're trying to do, and right now for Colorado seems like they really have the edge on it. There's a number of larger restorative practices organizations out of Colorado that have that large capacity that could take on a district like us. But the caveat is that they need to work also with our local community. And that's one of the key things. And that's one of the things that this organization who's coming in July is known for, is really partnering with local communities In fact, their framework is out of a Indigenous lens. And they've done work with, they haven't done work specifically with New Mexico tribal communities, but they've done it in Colorado and Montana. So they actually are working much more on an Indigenous framework than I've seen for any other vendor out there in terms of doing restorative practices work. So it's that combination of bringing someone who has that capacity, but really connecting with our local communities, because that's really the heart of how it's really going to, go in, because those local community members have already the buy-in from the community on there.
Thank you. That's encouraging. Could you give me the name of the organization again, please?
It is Board Member Dominguez. It's Restorative Justice Education. I have to preface that almost every restorative practices organization starts with restorative, so they can be very confusing, but this one's Restorative Justice Education out of Fort Collins. They're also working right now with the Denver Public Schools, and they're doing some really good connections, not only with Denver, but working with their local colleges and universities to partner as a continuum, and also looking at how they're offering even like certificates and course credit for their for educators in terms of working with the universities there. So again, they're really known as good collaborators, both community and education wise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Campos and Board Member Dominguez. I think we have one last comment or question from Board President Montoya Cordova.
And I just wanted to flag off of our Chairperson Gonzalez's concerns around the hearing officers. I do want to put a plug in there for making sure that it's sort of a generational piece on there, because I think there's going to be different perspectives in terms of the age, in terms of what hearing officers look like as well. But I also want to say it would be really helpful to have someone with a mental health background on there as well. So whether it's a social worker or a counselor who's looked at it from that lens as well, I think could also be a way to just make sure that we're also not just missing some undiagnosed piece as well. Because I think sometimes our children will fall through the cracks, and it's easy to say, it's so easy to say the family didn't follow through or the student didn't follow through, but it's not really about following through. Sometimes it's because the way that something's been presented or the type of referral or the mechanism for that referral is not necessarily workable. But I would highly, highly recommend a mental health professional as part of a hearing officer lead on there.
President Montoya Cordova, I did want to add one piece. Another action that was added this year for the hearing process is that for a school to bring a student to a hearing, they must answer a series of questions for their associate superintendent, who does work very closely with their schools. And they look at the child as a whole. What is the background of the student? Have they been referred to SAT? Are they in special education? Do they have a 504? And what interventions have been put in place? Because our associates are the ones that oversee and work directly with the schools. By the time the student gets to the hearing process is very simple. The hearing officer looks at, is there evidence that a violation was committed? Yes or no? And then in looking at the data and the evidence, do they either uphold what is recommended by the school or not uphold? But there isn't a process for the hearing officer to say, you should go back and, go to your mental health professional. That really is the process that our associates are looking at prior to a student coming through the hearing process, because the hearing process is a very scripted process.
Well, then obviously through that process of the discovery, because it sounds like there's this whole piece around discovering, putting a case together, if you will. I'm hoping then that one of those assessments that's being done is ACEs, is understanding, what were some of the ACEs for this particular child coming in that brought them to this piece, because I think that needs to be understood for sure, because that whole, so if the school is not prepared to do a trauma-informed approach, dealing with a number of ACEs, then it's no wonder that they may get expelled or they might get long-term suspended. So I think one is just making sure that that's part of a lens that they're looking at that from too, because that could very well help us sort of understand the gap too, in terms of our schools and being able to really be a trauma-informed approach or understanding how they might want to work in that vein. So maybe that's part of it as well.
And when they do come to hearing, the hearing officer cannot give a higher disciplinary action than the school has recommended, but they can give lower. And quite a few of the hearings have resulted in contracts back to the school.
Oh, nice. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that.
And Madam Chair, if I may, just explain that what ACEs is, adverse childhood experiences. I know that some individuals, I heard some whispers, what are ACEs?
Okay.
A lot of educational jargon we have.
It wasn't me. I totally knew what it was.
I believe you. Thank you for that. And I know we already did begin to have a bit more of a broader conversation than just the red line edits to that procedural directive. And so I think we'll probably continue to do that as we go. But with that, we'll go ahead and move to agenda item 4B, which is presentation of revisions to administrative procedural directive, student participation in activities and athletics, restrictions related to controlled substance, alcohol, and tobacco. And for this one, we have TC Reiser, Executive Director of the Student Family and Employee Service Center, and Dr. Gabriella Duran Blakey, Chief Operations Officer. Is what my script says, but I'm happy to go with whatever you all want.
It's like, not me.
Okay, so this procedural directive is on page 23 of your electronic documents. This procedural directive has minor changes to align with the updated handbook. This content is also duplicated in the proposed student handbook for next year. This is a discussion item that will be finalized by the cabinet, and we now stand for your comments and questions.
Great, thank you. Board members, are there any comments or questions?
I had a question.
Member Jackson.
Thank you. So I did send in this question, but I don't know that I'm still confused. So, okay. So page 24, sorry, page 23 to 24, the use and or possession, the discussion. So first violation, you are out for 10 school days, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Then you go to PIP. And if you have a second violation, if you can show completion of PIP, then you are eligible to be out for 30 days. Okay. But then reading down, it says second violation if you have not shown completion. So let's say you have your first violation, you're out for 10 days, you didn't do PIP. Then you come back. The way this reads to me is if you didn't do PIP and you get your second violation, you are now out for the remainder of the academic year. But the answer that I got was, well, you can do PIP again, or you can try to do PIP again, even if you have a second violation. So those seem to be they're fighting each other, conflict. Thank you. I mean, we're talking about conflict. Why didn't I know that word?
I remember, Jackson, I shouldn't have answered the question that way. You are correct. So if they did do PIP, then they do get that extra opportunity to continue to play. If they don't do PIP, don't go through any prevention method, then they would be out. And the answer that I gave is more for the handbook side for other violations.
Okay, for the other stuff. Okay, and that was going to be a follow-up question. So you've already answered it. Was that those again seem to be in conflict? Okay, so I think the only other question I have is I'm just curious why it was changed to school from calendar. Like I just noticed that, so I'm curious as to why. Seems like maybe changing it to school kind of creates more on page 23 and 24, where it says 10 school days instead of 10 calendar days. I'm in favor of it being school, don't get me wrong, but I'm just curious.
Member Jackson, I believe it was supposed to be school last year and we missed it. The old handbook had calendar in it. And if a student were to have a violation in December, say right before a break, then they could go right back to school and their violation is over without really any. So we updated it to make sure it was consistent and said school throughout.
Fantastic. I'm in favor that it was caught. And so I was just curious as to why. And then I think just my last question is, you know, over the course, both last year and this year, we kind of hear from high school principals how this actually works in practicality. So what kind of feedback did you receive from high school principals regarding this issue? In particular, like you have some football players who are drinking on the weekend, but they get to come back 10 days later.
We have a high school principal right behind us if you'd like her
Oh.
answer. But the changes that were made by our high school principals and brought forward this year during our working group. So these are changes suggested by high school principals.
By high school principals, okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that.
That's okay. Madam Chairperson Gonzalez, members of the board and Superintendent Elder. The beauty of this committee and the work that we've done here is we formed a principal committee. So our voices were heard because we are the people on the ground that are doing the work. So we were able to provide feedback, have some really deep conversations. You know, we discussed the law that was in place, policy and procedure. And then we did look at the different consequences as we went through this process. So do you mind repeating your question so I make sure that I answer your question?
Well, yeah, but thank you for that lead in. Like, I'm happy to hear that. And I'm sure the whole board is happy to know that your voices were heard. The question was, I mean, do you think that this is do you think this is a deterrent to, let's see, I'll choose somebody else, the volleyball players who are partying on the weekend and get caught and they're like, I'm only out for 10 days, no big deal. Like, do you think this is actually a deterrent?
Coming from the point of view of this, you know, the high school and students, I think this is definitely a fair and equitable consequence for them. Because in past, it had been, I believe, 45 days.
Mm-hmm.
And for 45 days, I mean, they're like, when we're looking at adolescents, you know, they make some bad decisions and, you know, that's their entire season. So our students work very hard, you know, our athletes, student athletes, to participate and be members of the school community, and they made a mistake. And so that I think this allows for them to be able to return back and say, hey, I'm not doing that again.
Fantastic. So what I'd be curious then is just any kind of follow-up, like data, like how often do the kids get to the second and third violation? I just think that would be, it doesn't have to be tomorrow, but just interesting to see how it actually plays out in the real world. So thank you for the background, and I'm glad to know that the principals had such a strong voice.
Welcome.
Great. Thank you both. Member Muller-Aragon.
I know, I'm just glad they're not out for so many days. That was just, so this is a win for the kids. So that's a good thing. So I know I didn't, and I'm just going to put it out there. I had asked for some data, and I just want to make sure, because I was told that coaches are not going to fill rosters. So a child is suspended and the tryouts are over, so they can come back, and tryouts are all finished for soccer. They're done. So the coach has to wait to allow whoever was suspended that wanted to try out and wasn't able to be there. They have to give them that opportunity. So they wait on filling that roster until the child who has been suspended is able to try out. And that is across the board, every school, every sport, correct?
You want it? Member Mueller-Aragon, on page 23, that third bullet does say that the student is serving a suspension cannot try out, participate in tryout during the suspension.
Right.
However, a coach shall provide a tryout opportunity to a student once the suspension is complete. I did speak with our athletic director, and he said that is what coaches are taught.
Good. Okay. I'm glad about that. And then the other question is, I would also like to have some data about who this disproportionately affects. Is it females? Is it, are there more football players that get in trouble that, is it more, our African-American students, our Hispanic students? Who is it really affecting? And I know I asked that question and you all said that you had to review how this data was entered into Synergy, but I think that's data that would be really important for us to know who it's really affecting, what sports it may affect. And I mean, because I think that would tell us a lot about what we may need to do to make things better. So whenever you get it, if you could just share it with us, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Member Dominguez?
Yes, thank you. Regarding PIP, if I remember correctly from a previous presentation, maybe a year ago, lack of follow through was cited as one reason for 50% participation or completion rate for that program. So I guess it's more of a comment. We can't continue to do the same thing. At some point, I'd like to know how we are addressing substance abuse in, if kids are going out and getting drunk on weekends, then it's not just that moment. And so how are we providing opportunities to really get at a learning experience that comes with the consequence? Yeah, and just reconsidering doing something different than what we've got in place. That's it. Thank you.
Madam Chair and Board Member Dominguez, we did have this conversation with our staff regarding PIP and its efficacy. What we determined and what we heard loudly from principals is that PIP is something that we do after the fact, and what is needed is prevention education. And I don't know if we all remember back in the day, we had the DARE to Keep Kids Off Drugs program. I think I still might have my t-shirt from elementary, but nonetheless, that grant went away. And so did the prevention programming. And so we actually put forth a recommendation to be able to hire 2 additional Crossroads counselors to be able to work with our elementaries and middle schools with prevention. It's definitely needed. And we're seeing our principals are seeing the vaping and the smoking and the drugs that are the escalation and just the level and severity of drug use has increased. And so we know that there's a need. We are also looking to partner with our community members regarding what resources they may have, because we can't do it alone. When our kids leave our schools, they're going into the community, and we need partnership and wraparound in our entire city. So that's part of what we're doing at this time.
I had a reaction to when you mentioned DARE, the DARE program. Quite frankly, as a parent, I was horrified because I thought of, other parents and kids that I knew, and it was shaming. It gave no support for how to deal. What does a child do when that child is in a household? Parents still need to talk about parents with a sense of dignity and respect, because that child's going home to that parent. And DARE did not do that. And I did speak to the officer afterwards, but I'm hoping that we have a better model than DARE. I hope we've evolved since then. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Dominguez. Are there any other questions or comments on this procedural directive?
I just have a quick question. So, and thank you, Dr. Segura. You mentioned that adding 2 additional crossroad counselors to add to middle and elementary, because we only have 2 crossroad counselors going through all the middle schools. Yeah, and I mean, I think just adolescence as a whole, that's the age where risk begins. And so I think it would be great to really think and utilize our own data. I'm assuming we probably have YRS data that tells us a little bit about the risks our kids are taking at that age, or anything that we might have to add some additional supports there, because I can't imagine that 2 crossroad counselors for just the middle schools is adequate.
Right. We have the 2 right now, and they've requested to add 2 additional so that they can work with the middle and elementaries in their zone.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. We will move on to agenda item 4C.
Madam Chair, this is Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
I have a quick question about the Crossroads counselors. Do they work with students regarding all substances or just alcohol?
Out a little bit, but I think the question is, do the Crossroad counselors work with students regarding all substances? And there was an or and we lost you, but I think Dr. Muir is full
yes
to answer that.
No. Sure. Come on in.
Thank you. I think I caught the question. The Crossroad counselors work with all substances, but not tobacco. We refer out for tobacco prevention. And so that's the only substance that they don't. So it's the narcotics, everything. So it's not, it's drugs and alcohol, basically. But for tobacco prevention, we refer out for tobacco prevention programming. And tobacco doesn't put you into PIP either.
Thank you, Member Peterson. Did that answer your question?
Yes, and just one other update, and I can get the information later. I appreciate all of the other comments that have been made. I would really like to hear from some Crossroads counselors and with the results of PIP. What's the success rate of it? What's the participation rate? And what evidence do we see?
We're losing you again, Member Peterson, but I think the question is a request for further information about effectiveness of PIP and Crossroads.
And we will provide that. We're going to be doing
correct
election this coming school year. So we will have this past school year, each high school got to design their own program with some codicils that had to be in there. And so it was really difficult to collect data that went across the board, but we're going to be looking at specific data points that need to come out of PIP. I did want to respond quickly to the other question that was asked, and that PIP, it's in that the presentation we did a few years ago, PIP changed drastically since then. And it used to be several day program, and it was taken down to 1 day, which changed how many people could come and that they would participate, because it's all they had to do is show up for 1 day. So we didn't see people that, showed up for 1 day and then they weren't there for the others, which means they didn't complete PIP. So the only way you can't complete it now if you go is if to leave early. And so it's a 1 day, 1 evening, and it's not all day, it's an evening program. And the way that it works right now with the middle schools is the Crossroad counselors are doing PIP for middle school. So in order to do the preventative programming that Dr. Segura was talking about, we need more Crossroad counselors. And in the high schools, they do both because they have a single counselor for each high school. But right now in the middle school, that's all they can handle is doing the PIP programming for the whole district.
Great. Thank you for that. Member Dominguez, your hand is up. Do you have another question or comment or nope. Okay. So we thank you all. And we will go ahead and move to agenda item 4C, presentation of revisions to administrative procedural directive for student dress. TC and Dr. Segura, you have the floor.
Okay, this procedural directive is on page 28 of your electronic documents. This procedural directive has updates to prohibited clothing items, options for students not following the school dress code, and guidance for elective courses with specific dress and or hair requirements. This is a discussion item that will be finalized by the cabinet, and we stand for your comments and questions.
Great. Thank you for that. Any questions or comments on this one?
I mean, Madam Chair, the only thing I would like again is data about who gets, and this is just what I've heard, it may not be true or not, is the violations for student dress disproportionately go toward girls. And so I just want to know if that's, if that's true or not. And I mean, I just personally have a hard time punishing students based on their clothing choices. And I just wanted to let that be known out there. So having had 3 daughters and how much trouble they got in for what they wore. And then now I see things that weren't even around when my kids were, the jeans are almost torn the entire length of a leg. And so I'm like, okay, they think it's cool, I mean, I'm like, why am I paying that much money for that? But just what I think. And just that, I mean, I'm just worried that it just is affecting more females than it is males. So, if somebody is wearing, I mean, I see those, I don't know what shirt, like muscle kind of shirts. They can't wear those, right?
Yeah.
Madam Chair and Board Member Mueller-Aragon, I believe that every school has worked with each of their communities to determine their dress code, which makes me nervous. But at this time, I think it's varied and it does create variation, and that's what makes me nervous and inequities. So I think at some schools, a muscle shirt would be allowed, and in others, it would not.
Because I mean, I'm just thinking about, it said here like underclothing worn as primary clothing items. Well, if at some schools where I've seen the guys can wear, a muscle shirt, but if a girl wears something similar than that, and then she has a sports bra on, well, that's underclothing that's obviously showing. And so I'm just concerned about the differences that there may be at different schools. And just that I just don't want it to be something where a girl can say, it's just always happens, but that seems to be the case. So it's just something for you all to just think about and just kind of let us know what that data is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Member Tapia Romero?
The only comment I have with that is I agree with you. What you said, Dr. Segura, is that it does vary from school to school. And that does make it challenging for principals and, administration to really have something that's uniform across the district. I know it's the way it is, but I agree that I wish it was the same across the board. That's it.
Thank you. Member Dominguez?
What kind of support do we give principals who are having a hard time with that issue?
With dress code specifically or
Well, just I know, principals have been vocal about, how struggling with young women in particular, and inevitably it's young women, but young men also, and it's interesting to be on this side of that conversation now, because what is it the boys called it when they not dragging but
sagging.
We had that conversation in my household. And it just didn't
support provided to principals on interpretation of these policies.
So I mean, when you struggle, we do in the classroom, and administrators have to face, kids that are thrown out of class because they're sagging inappropriately or wearing a sports bra, even though they've got a tank top on. How does the district support the conversations that need to happen to address those?
Member Dominguez, we have Principal Laura Chiang from Kennedy Middle School here to provide some input.
Chairperson Dominguez, members of the board and Superintendent Elder. When speaking to my colleagues, I'm also a lead principal in my zone, so I have conversations with newer principals. I like to take us back to a time when we were so grateful our students were back from COVID and a lot of things were quote unquote let go because we were so excited for our students to be there. They were in our classrooms. They were able to do an extent of hands-on learning, be with their peers. And I think some people have forgotten the commitments they made to themselves about the importance of students being in school and learning and having access to material, regardless what material is on their own body. I think we are moving away from a time of traditional dress, and we need to remember what we see as traditional male and female and not forget our non-binary and our members of the LGBTQ plus community. I am a principal that I adhere to the procedural directive, and I use that in my guideline, and I do not have any other additional rules for my dress code because with my school, my culture, and my community, it's very important that students are there and they're learning, and that is more important than what they are wearing. And I personally have not had issues with it. So I'm very glad to be part of this working group and doing this work and making sure that our language is gender neutral, because I am very cognizant as a school principal that dress code has originated in the oppression of women and minorities. And I think we need to keep that in mind, and also where we are in today's time and what our focus is in our classrooms.
Great. Thank you for that. And it does sound like an opportunity at a later date just to look at that data and explore and also just determine what additional supports may be needed. Are there other questions or comments on this one? All right, we will go ahead and move. Thank you for all of that. We'll go ahead and move to agenda item 4D, presentation of the 2023-2024 APS Handbook for Student Success. And Ms. Reiser, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening, Chairperson Gonzalez, members of the committee, and Superintendent Elder. We bring for your discussion the Handbook for Student Success for the 2023-24 school year. The handbook begins, the edited version of the handbook begins on page 34 of your electronic documents. The first section of the handbook, pages 2 through 23 of the document, has some minor updates to language, updated goals and guardrails, and updated or deleted links to policy and procedural directive. As a reminder, if a policy or procedural directive is updated throughout the year, the link would still be to the most current document in the electronic version. The second part of our handbook is the Code of Conduct. This begins on page 24 of the handbook, moving from electronic document page numbers, but to your handbook page numbers here to make it a little simpler. So it begins on page 24 of the handbook. The Code of Conduct section will have no changes during the school year and is formatted in a way that can be printed. Copies of the Code of Conduct can be requested from the Service Center and or printed at any school. The Code of Conduct was updated collaboratively through a working group that you've heard about a little bit throughout the evening. And this working group met weekly from February 7th through May 30th. The working group included 4 high school principals, 5 middle school principals, 6 elementary school principals, our principal support specialists, and our associate superintendents. So we had representation from all zones. The working group collaborated with APS Police, the Office of Equal Opportunity, our counseling for Crossroads program input, and we had legal counsel. The working group goals were to update the Code of Conduct to support consistency in disciplinary consequences across the district. So that was our main goal, was consistency across the district while aligning to the policy and procedural directive. In addition, it was important that the language was clear and understood to our principals, so that the principal group could train and discuss with their colleagues. This handbook was reviewed by all principals on May 5th. So some of the updates to the Code of Conduct: infraction was changed to violation. That was to align to the language and synergy. Consequence is now consequence/disposition because disposition is the language that is used in Synergy. Violations were reordered by severity. They were previously alphabetical. Up to language was utilized to give a maximum consequence, but to allow for lower consequences to be utilized. Early childhood, basically pre-K to third grade, are separated into the consequences, as those are not grades that would typically be considered for the hearing process. All consequence sections state utilize intervention strategies. The working group is continuing to meet and is drafting a separate document with intervention strategies, and is working with both the SEL departments that work with SEL and our restorative practice department. In addition, there is currently a group working on conflict mediation and restorative practices. Foundational training will be conducted on July 14th by Restorative Justice Education out of Fort Collins, Colorado. This training is for all school and district administrators. Ongoing support will be provided for schools this year in a differentiated format beginning in September. As a reminder, the handbook review is an annual process, and our working group will continue meeting later in July. The handbook is for your discussion, and it will be finalized by the cabinet later this month. With that, we stand for comments and questions, but I do want to introduce, we have Antoinette Valenzuela, principal at Rio Grande High School, Laura Chiang, principal at Kennedy Middle School, and Ana Chavez, principal at Alameda Elementary School, here to assist with any of the discussion questions, and they were part of our working group.
Yes. Great, thank you for that, Ms. Reiser, and to the members of the working group who are present tonight and available to answer questions. And also thank you for your work as part of the working group. With that, we will just open the floor to questions and comments on the handbook.
Well, my questions were answered.
Member Jackson, or if not, I'll go.
Well, yeah, so I'm sure I have more, but just as I was trying to talk to you, I was listening really intently. Differentiated format training regarding restorative practices. What does that mean? You're going to do a foundational training for all of the principals on July 14th, and then a differentiated training. How is it differentiated?
I could give a brief answer. Some schools are already, Member Jackson, some schools are already using restorative practices. So that initial training is to get everyone on the same page. And then they'll look at where each school is sitting with what they're currently doing to kind of differentiate so that we're not going back and retraining where they've already been trained in restorative practices and have it utilizing in the school already.
Okay, but sorry, I'm looking at you. You said that we're bringing in restorative justice education from Fort Collins to kind of do foundational so that we're all on the same page. Because again, going back to the beginning, I think Dr. Segura, what you said is we were all trained on, everybody was trained on different aspects of this. So when you differentiate the training, are you going to make sure that everything's in line with one system?
So Member Jackson, correct. So first, the foundation is exactly that. There are schools that are at little different levels that have done work on their own. So we want to make sure we're meeting them at that. However, we have not done a district-wide training or implementation on even what we mean by restorative practices or restorative justice. So we all need to have those foundational understandings and definitions to make sure we're on one page as a district and be at that level. And, some schools are at different levels, but then some schools maybe potentially think that they're at a higher level than they might be at that. So we just need to make sure we're all together and consistent. We're using consistent wording. So for instance, when we say restorative conversation, what does that mean? We all need to be on that same page. And then at that point, so it's the balance of making sure as a district we're aligned, but then giving each school the autonomy and the flexibility to develop something that's going to meet the needs of their school.
And so who will be determining that differentiation? Is it the vendor that you've hired, or is it APS employees? Like, as you go into these other schools, how are you going to determine that Who
Member
determines
Jackson,
it?
That's clearly still a conversation we're having, but probably will be a combination. Certainly, we're looking at our trainers. They are the expert. They've done this with multiple school districts and multiple areas. So they do have that expertise to come in and give us guidance. But certainly, we're also looking district-wide. We're also part of this principals working group. I actually have now a subcommittee of principals working with this on restorative practices with our equity team. So it will be that combination on there. So we absolutely want to honor what schools have already done. But again, we do need to make sure everyone's aligned.
Right. Okay, thank you. That's it for now.
That's it for now. Thank you. So I had some questions about the proposal to shift to permanent expulsion as the minimum requirement for firearm use and firearm possession, which is on page 99 of the electronic packet, page 30 of the handbook itself. Now my question was, what research supports this shift towards permanent expulsion as a minimum consequence for firearm possession? What evidence supports the claim that a no excuse, zero tolerance, tougher consequence will convince students to leave guns at home?
It's not page 30.
So it's not really, I mean, we don't need to consult the page itself. It's just what evidence supports the decision to move to this tougher consequence.
And so, Madam Chair, members of the board, I believe that in working with this working group of principals and listening to community members come to board meetings and speak about their feeling of lack of safety within their school environment, from students afraid to go to school, staff afraid to go to school and be able to do their job comfortably, and families afraid to send their kids to schools. That was some of the data and understanding of what the conversations were in the working group. And so I can have Principal Valenzuela speak more to that because she was there for all of the conversations.
Madame Gonzalez, members of the board, and Superintendent Alder. This was a very in-depth conversation because we went, back and forth, what was our reasoning behind this, what data did support this. And I think at the end of all of our conversations and going back and forth, it was safety and security for ourselves as the principals, because we are, along with APS Police, we're the first line of defense that goes out to really deal with situations as such, and then our staff and students. So we want to make sure that in a situation where it is a weapon possession, and currently it is the 1 year expulsion, up to 1 year expulsion, is really thinking about the trauma that we are dealing with when we know come March of next year, we have students that will be returning that were in possession of a firearm. So that is where the conversations have led. So I think our primary concern was safety and security for everyone at that school, at our schools.
Thank you for that. And again, for the seeking of feedback from principals. And I understand the trauma that individuals across the board experience. I also have significant concerns around the long-term trauma that this causes to the student, the family, and the community, this being permanent expulsion. And so just to offer, because our procedural directives do refer to the American Psychological Association, I Googled American Psychological Association evidence on these things, and so I'm just going to read to you what it says. They convened a task force on this issue, and they determined that these policies being zero tolerance, may negatively affect the relationship of education with juvenile justice and appear to conflict to some degree with current best knowledge concerning adolescent development. To address the needs of schools for discipline that can maintain school safety while maximizing student opportunity to learn, which I think is the main challenge we're speaking to here, The report offers recommendations for both reforming zero tolerance where its implementation is necessary and for alternative practice to replace zero tolerance where a more appropriate approach is indicated. And so I appreciate the perspectives of the individuals who are consulted, but I would like us to make our policies, our procedural directives with evidence in mind. And I know this is a grave issue, and it doesn't seem that there's any evidence to support the notion that a tougher consequence of permanent expulsion has any correlation, any connection to the decision-making of adolescents whose brains are not fully developed yet. So I think just considering that there's no link between a stronger consequence and whether or not kids are going to bring a gun to school. So I'll state that. I know we do not have a say here, but have received a significant amount of emails expressing concern for that. I do also just want to express and read our student discipline policy, which reads, the district approach to student success reflects the Board of Education's desire to work with students in school communities to understand and address root causes of behavior. So this is our approach to discipline. Understand and address root causes of behavior, resolve conflicts, repair harm done, restore relationships, and successfully sustain and reintegrate students into the school community. So it's hard for me to see how permanent expulsion entirely from APS forever does any of these things that are listed in our policy. So I would just encourage the administration to go back and consider just the relationship between this policy and this procedural directive, because it seems to me to be pretty out of whack. So with that, I will leave that as my recommendation and see if there are any other comments or questions on this particular agenda item, which is the student handbook.
Madam Chair, this is Barbara. I will just, can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Connection. I will just second what Chairperson Gonzalez just stated. And I would like to see, I mean, I really appreciate the description of how we're moving forward that Ms. Reiser gave, and I would like to see some version of that actually in the handbook to say, you know, while we learn restorative practices, it doesn't mean that there aren't some guidelines for how we're working with students. But we know that all of these punitive measures don't ultimately create the kinds of behaviors and healthy students that we really want to have. And so I would just like, and maybe the policy that you just read should be in the handbook explicitly as well, written out so that that's something that people see first off. And I think one of the things that's discomforting to people right now is that, especially this past year, some people felt like they were working without real guidelines. They were sort of fishing through trying to figure out how to deal with some pretty serious and dangerous behaviors. But I think we know how we need to move forward. So I would just like those included in the handbook. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Peterson. I see Member Dominguez has her hand raised, and I think a few other members want to get in as well.
I think this issue goes right back to what Barbara Peterson, Board Member Peterson, talked about earlier, and that is, what are the children can't stop, or they don't stop learning. We have to provide a safe and a learning situation for that child who brought a gun to school. I don't think our responsibility ends with expulsion. That child is still part of the community and learning something. And I'd rather that we have impact over what that child is learning rather than other people in that child's circle. And I'll just leave it at that. I think there's work to be done around how do we continue a positive learning experience for kids who get themselves into trouble, or who are faced with untenable circumstances. They can't be throwaway kids. And yet I want to honor the very real sense of insecurity that schools are feeling.
Great. Thank you, Member Dominguez. And I think one point sort of implicit perhaps in those comments is just the lack of distinction or differentiation between elementary students and high school students. So clearly there's something different going on if a 5-year-old is bringing a gun versus an 18-year-old. So to have the same consequence for both, like, again, seems a little disconnected or in conflict. So I know Member Muller-Aragon wanted to get in, and then I think Member just over here. These ones to the right.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I understand what the principals were doing, and I just respect your work. You wanted to make your staff feel safe, your students it's all with, your students feel safer, and you're doing it with the best of intentions. And I know that none of us are saying that that isn't what happened. And that was one way you thought it's going to make your community and your kids and your staff feel safer. So I do appreciate all the work you all did on that. But I feel as a school district that we have to provide the supports for every child, whatever it is that they need. If they bring a gun to school, they need something, and we don't know what kind of ACEs they went through during their life. And so I think that we need to provide them the supports in the safest way that we can to keep people around them, from getting harmed in any way. So I think we need to think about it. We're here to educate every child. And as Member Dominguez said, I personally believe almost every single person can be saved, and we can help almost everybody to make better choices. I don't believe in that throwaway mentality at all. So it's up to you all. I think you're hearing what most of us are saying, that permanent expulsion, that child is going to be out in the community with, no restrictions whatsoever. They're not going to be in class. What are they going to be doing? And they're still out there, and they can still harm people unless we provide the services that I think that they need. So it's something we need to kind of think about. And then I just have one more, just to kind of ask, and I know you answered my question, but I'm still kind of confused. So TC, on the audio, video recording or photographs, I think it's page 47, and it says that students shall not use audio or visual recording devices to video, photograph, or record handbook violations or to violate the privacy of others. That's good. But then I look, and this is just a question you can just clarify for me. So then I look at page 56, and it's talking about controlled substance sale or distribution. And it says distribution and sale require evidence to include photos. Mm-hmm. So do those photos can't come from a child who photographed that sale or that distribution? Because it says that it can't. So are you talking about that the APS police or APD have to provide the photos? And then the same thing on threats of violence. It says threats of violence require evidence to include photos, social media posts. But yet, to go back to number 16 again, on page 47 says that students can't photograph.
Member Muller-Aragon. So number 16 does say students cannot, that it is a violation of the handbook, but students still do take photographs and post them on social media and do use apps to sell drugs on campus. So they are using their devices for items that are then used as evidence by our administrators when bringing them to a hearing. So the evidence piece is the adults collecting the evidence
Okay.
of what students have done, but still it's not allowable for them to utilize their phones in that way on campus.
Okay. And that's what I thought you were trying to get to. I just wanted to just clarify. And then I gave all my others, so everybody knows all the other little edits. TC has them, so I don't have to go through like 500.
Great. Thank you, Member Muller-Aragon. Member Member Tapia Romero.
So I'm probably going to speak in opposition of what others have said, because I am in favor of the policy, you know, as it's written. Like, this is something we've dealt with these last several months that has been like reality of what's happening in our classrooms and our schools. And I'm thinking as a mom, and if my girls are dealing with a situation where another student has a firearm, like, I want severe consequences. Like, that's where my head is going. Like, at what point are we saying, well, their safety isn't the forefront of everything we do? I don't think anyone said that we're not going to provide support for the student that needs them, but there has to be a severe consequence of making sure that these students just don't return back in a classroom. Like, I'm thinking, me as a mom, and knowing I have that student sitting right next to my daughter that came with a firearm that could have had an intention or reason of hurting my child. Like, I'm not okay with that. And to me, that even adds to all the reasons why we talk about declining enrollment and things changing and people leaving our district. A lot of it is we're not protecting all of our students. Like, we can't forget the ones that are really there to do what they're supposed to do. Truly. And I'm like, my gosh, we've had West Mesa here almost every board meeting saying, do something, stand up. They feel like they're not safe. We've heard from other schools throughout the district, other families and students. Students have died. Yet we're not acting like this is a policy that we need to have in place, and we need to kind of sugarcoat it based on other students and the trauma that they've had. We agree, they need support, they need services. But I need to ensure that my girls are safe. Like, every child there is going to be safe and they get the education they deserve. And it like hurts me, because I'm like, are we really saying this? Like, we're really saying that we don't agree with the policy to not protect our students. It saddens me, because this stuff is real. It's happening all the time. Like, I'm seeing stuff that I've never even had as an adult that our students have access to every day. And I'm sorry if that's just my style. You guys know I just speak freely and off like the cuff sometimes, but I'm like, come on. Like, we can't really think like that's appropriate. But just my opinion.
Great, thank you. Member Jackson?
Sure. So I will also follow up with that. I wrote in my notes that I was completely in agreement with the more severe restrictions. And I think part of that, listening to the conversation, I think I'm very black and white. If you do something wrong, you have to have consequences for that. But we've also heard from several of you of all of the other things that APS is attempting to do to lead up to this event, right? We are doing restorative practices. We are meeting with our students. We are providing resources. We're providing all of these things. But at some point, if you're bringing a gun to school, there has to be a consequence for that. And I'm in favor of the consequence that is currently, or has been updated in the procedural directive. And I also think of the fact that because we realize this is an issue, we have also been proactive, right? We're going to start initiating a curriculum within APS that talks about gun violence prevention. We're going to be continuing to offer resources for our children, for all of our students, to at every step along the way, what could you do different? How can we help? We are here. We are here to help you. But to Board Member Tapia Romero's point, there are, let's just take a middle school as an example. There are 800 other kids in that middle school that now are fearful to attend because of one person. And we have to start thinking about the benefit or the safety and the well-being of all of our kids. And I did have a conversation with somebody earlier today, kind of concerned about the expulsion language. And I think what came out of that is we, APS, and all of the organizations that are consistently being brought up, right? We're hearing about city resources. We're hearing about, PIP and Crossroads and all of this. There are also so many resources within the community, and we have to start doing a better job, APS, of communicating with all of those entities, all of those resources that we have. I don't know that we do a good job with reaching out and sharing. And in a situation like this, I think of the child who does get expelled. Well, let's make sure that we're doing a good job when that happens of following up with other organizations within the community to make sure that that child doesn't get lost. But there are other kids, there's other staff members, there are other parents, there are other people in that school that shouldn't have to bear the burden of feeling fear because of one child. So I appreciate that you put that there. I am in support, and that's my black and white 2 cents for you.
Great. Thank you, Member Jackson. Are there any other comments or questions from the board on the handbook?
I feel like I need to weigh in. I'm on the fence actually on this because I truly understand the concerns about, and what happens for me in the language, the way that I read it is only the superintendent may modify in writing. And so there's an opportunity for modification and there's an opportunity for a hearing. So, and I'm going back to TC's words initially earlier where you said a hearing officer could also, it could go lower, it can't go higher, but could go lower. So I think the intention of a handbook is to communicate a consequences, to communicate, the what if scenarios. And I know that one of the things that we've wanted to do is we've wanted to have a very strong message about don't do this, because if you do, it could have huge consequences. So I think we've done a good job of describing that this is very grave and it does rise to that level of that. I think and I have to go back and maybe it's going back through the handbook, is just reminding folks that, that a hearing is also an opportunity there, because I am concerned about the elementary kid that gets expelled. I mean, that to me is the one that just makes me a little bit anxious because I just think about the age and what's going on there. So I think for me is just looking at that. And I know she's an elementary principal. So yeah, go ahead.
Chairperson Gonzalez, members of the board and Superintendent Elder, I'm here to speak on the differentiation between elementary and secondary disciplinary, and also the considerations of including elementary on the same level. And what that is an opportunity for us to start the conversation and start teaching what those consequences are. And in order for us to teach that, we also have to have some supports in place. So this really does allow elementaries to become part of the conversation with families instead of it just waiting until they get to middle school and high school. So this opens up the opportunity for us to have a first teach in elementary around our expected behaviors of safety. And it also highlight some of the supports that can be in the community that we have access to if we're starting to see some behaviors that come up that could become concerning, and they do start at an early age. The permanent expulsion hearing is an opportunity. It's a process, and having elementary part of that creates more conversation and more awareness. It does not mean that the permanent expulsion is, it automatically happens. The hearing is the process to figure out if that's the most appropriate next step to take. And we do have flexibility within that. So, but to have elementary in that with secondary does open up that opportunity.
And I thank you so much for saying that, because I keep going back to thinking about the purpose of the handbook, right? The purpose of the handbook is to just really lay out here's the rules, here's the rules of the game, you know, this is the rules of engagement for dealing with us or working with us. So, because you're right. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's going to result. And I think it's like it says, you know, it does provide for mandatory expulsion, but it, you know, and the superintendent and that hearing is really the level that's going to determine that. And hopefully it's like you said, it's like this first teach, because I think also on the middle and high school, I've heard of some instances this year where even at the high school level, a person showed up with a gun in possession, but really didn't. It was almost like it was a lapse of judgment for sure. There's no doubt. But nonetheless, at high school, you should know I shouldn't be going to high school with a gun, right? An elementary age kid could potentially just, you know, if it's not secured at home, put it in the backpack, you know, but not really have intention. And it's really more around the parents and, you know, not having it safely secured and stuff, but it's still grave. And I get that because an accident could occur. And so I'm okay with this as the way that it's written, because I keep going back to what TC said about that hearing. And so maybe we need to be really clear about, you know, I think we do. I just can't remember. There's a lot of pages in there, but just really reminding our families, you do have process. There's due process through a hearing, but this one is one of the most gravest things that could happen. And it doesn't matter how the gun gets into possession of a child, whether it's by accident or things like that. And hopefully we're not, expelling elementary age kids. I mean, I'm hoping that that's not what's occurring. And that we don't use it as an excuse to expel a kid, because a kid could have some other behavior issues, other things that are going on. But again, they still have due process. And if they have an IEP, it's also coming back to that as well. So I struggle with that, because I'm always going to be on the side of, you know, making sure that our children also have an opportunity first, and we're not sort of like creating this pipeline in a different way. But I appreciate the language.
Thank you, President Montoya Cordova. I would like to point out a couple of things on page 29 of the handbook under expulsion. It is not new language, and it does say it may be longer or even permanent when we talk about expulsion, because expulsion is 1 year or longer. And then the Gun-Free Schools Act under firearm use does say mandatory expulsion for a period of not less than 1 year. And when we're looking at those consequences, when we're talking about going to a hearing, that's the maximum consequence that a principal can recommend when bringing a student to a hearing, right? But it does still go through that hearing process and does still have the ability to be appealed, which then does go to Superintendent Elder for review.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Are there any additional comments or questions on the student handbook? Great, Ms. Reiser, can you give an update just on the time frame? You said this will go back to cabinet for additional review and discussion, and then sort of what's the remaining timeline?
Yes, Member Gonzalez, my expectation is to provide an updated handbook to the cabinet by the end of the day tomorrow for them to have a few weeks to review, and that we would finalize it by the end of June to post on the website and begin getting copies for the service center.
Great, thank you. And so with that, we will move to agenda item 5, which is policy chair update. So I wanted to provide an update on where a couple of different policies and processes stand. So as you may remember, in our May meeting, we talked about the ad hoc policy review committee as recommended by the Council of Great City Schools as part of the student outcomes focused governance work. We appointed, President Cordova appointed myself, Member Peterson, and Member Tapia Romero to this ad hoc policy review committee. So we had a preliminary conversation and made some initial decisions and set some goals and timelines that I just wanted to bring everyone up to speed on. So this policy review ad hoc committee will be decided to and will be conducting a review of our current policies A, C, D, and E in June, and the rest of the policies after that. So I'll say a little bit more about the process. You may have noticed I said A, C, D, and E, but not B, and that's because policies B are the board governance policies essentially, and board members Jackson and Dominguez are simultaneously participating in a policy review crosswalk of those policies in support of the development of a board governance manual. So it's kind of a similar timeline. That work that they're doing will come to us for review and discussion around the beginning of the school year as well. So with respect to the policy review ad hoc committee, the committee members are going to review all of those policies against a rubric. It's a 10-point scale. And so we'll basically, each person will essentially rate each of the policies on that 10-point scale. And the continuum is sort of 0 being all administrative, 10 being all board, 5 being balance of board and administration. And so we've decided to try to use 5, that middle marker, as the point at which we would bring them forward for additional discussion and talk through what we sort of table, or not table is the right word, set aside, move into an administrative manual versus keep in policy. So we're using that 5 threshold as on the rubric as a starting point. So when we meet again at the end of June, which will be June 23rd, it'll give us an opportunity to do a couple of things. One is just sort of to consider like inter-rater operability. How aligned are we with each other on how we're rating each policy? And does 5 make sense for us? Is it, or do we want to maybe adjust maybe up higher, 6, 7, 8, or lower, 4, 3, et cetera. So we'll do that. We'll meet again in June. We'll discuss those 2 things. And then based on that conversation, we'll go ahead with the remainder of the policies throughout July, and then bring back sort of final recommendations back to the full board in August. So that's the first thing, is this policy review ad hoc committee. And I think folks remember that sort of 3 big questions. Is the policy legally required? Does it fall under the purview of the Board of Education or the superintendent? That's where we're using the rubric for scoring. And to what extent does it impact the board's non-negotiable priorities and goals, or our goals and guardrails? So that is the status of that. And then I just wanted to give an update on sort of what's on the hopper for the August policy committee. So these are the following policies which are up for consideration in August. The first is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act / American with Disabilities Act compliance, which is currently under review to update those policies to be in compliance with alignment with the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which goes into effect June 27th. So there's that process. Those policies will come to us in August. Similarly, the Indian education policies and procedures have been reviewed by district staff, and they're now awaiting approval by tribal leaders and committee members at the June 22nd Indian policies and procedures meeting. So once that happens, we'll have that feedback. Those revisions will be changed, and those will be brought to us as well in the August policy committee meeting. The next one is policy IH8, which is our community schools policy. So folks may recall that we reviewed all of our I policies in February. And we took this one off the subsequent consent agenda for the Board of Education meeting to allow time for both additional discussion, but also review, and particularly review from the ABC and community schools staff. So that process is happening right now. We'll have their feedback. And again, that IH8 will come to us in August. And then the final one is the new budget policy. So again, you may recall that in May, we had an initial review of a model budget policy just to get the juices flowing and start a brainstorm around what we would like to see in a budget policy. So following that brainstorm, now this policy development will go sort of through the standard policy development process. So the policy will be developed. There'll be a first read, which will be at the August committee meeting, opportunity for public input, and then a second read, and then it goes on to the consent approval agenda for the full board meeting following that. So it's an exciting time in the policy world, lots of stuff in front of us. And as a reminder, since we meet the first Monday of the month, that would conflict with the 4th of July holiday. So we will not be having a July Policy Committee meeting. And the next Policy Committee meeting will be held on Monday, August 7th at 5 p.m. in the John Milne Community Boardroom of the Alice and Bruce King Educational Complex, 6400 Uptown Boulevard, or virtually at aps.edu. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
But we're not done. Okay. So we do have a special board meeting. So we'll go ahead and take a break and then we'll come back.
back, I think of some comments. They want their, they didn't, I'm a little funny. Principals, I had the same argument you guys. I said, really? So you need to prepare.
Okay, we're ready.
I'm like, you guys
Great. Welcome to the Board of Education Special Board Meeting. I would like to call the meeting to order. Ms. King, may I have a roll call, please?
Peggy Mueller Aragon,
Here.
Danielle Gonzalez,
Here.
Barbara Peterson,
I'm not getting any more emails.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Here.
Josefina Dominguez, Courtney Jackson,
Here.
Yolanda Montoya Cordova.
Here. I'm not going to go through the meeting format. We just read that for the last meeting. So our first item for consideration and action is adoption of the June 5th, 2023 Special Board of Education meeting agenda. May I have a motion, please?
I will move for adoption of the June 5th, 2023 Special Board of Education meeting agenda.
I'll second. This is Peggy.
We have a roll call, please.
Peggy Mueller Aragon,
Yes.
Danielle Gonzalez,
Yes.
Barbara Peterson, Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez, Courtney Jackson,
Yes.
Yolanda Montoya Cordova.
Yes. So our next item is consideration for the Board of Education to convene an executive session as authorized by the Public Meetings Act, Section 1015(1)(h)(7), to discuss the legal matter of Arnold Gachupin and Judy Gachupin individually and as guardians and next to friends for NS a minor versus Loviata Mitchell, Manuel Alzaga, and Albuquerque Public Schools. May I have a motion, please?
I will move for the consideration for the Board of Education to convene an executive session as authorized by the Public Meetings Act, Section 10-15(1)(h)(7) to discuss the legal matter of do I need to keep going?
You don't have to.
Okay, to discuss the legal matter as described.
Second, this is Courtney.
Have a roll call, please.
Peggy Mueller Aragon.
Yes.
Danielle Gonzalez.
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero,
Yes.
Courtney Jackson.
Yes.
Yolanda Montoya Cordova.
Yes.
Josefina's on. Did she say?
I am, yeah,
Josefina Dominguez.
yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we'll, I think we're all clear. Are we all clear?